Hey, good morning. We are going to just do a quick piece right now on the Zionist propaganda machine and the U.S. propaganda machine. This is for you if you are just waking up to the PR ecosystem that we live in, okay? So understanding the Zionist and U.S. propaganda machines. Introduction. If you're just waking up to how information is controlled globally, it's important to understand two major influence systems that shape how people see the world: the Zionist propaganda machine and the U.S. propaganda machine. These systems heavily shape public perception, policy, and political decisions. The public perception is the one that we really want to pay attention to. The Zionist propaganda machine refers to the organized efforts, primarily by groups aligned with the State of Israel and its interests, to shape international opinion in favor of Israeli policies. It's powerful, sophisticated, and deeply embedded across media, education, politics, and digital platforms. What it does: it controls the narrative, actively shapes discussions about Israel, often portraying the country exclusively as a victim while downplaying or completely suppressing Palestinian perspectives and human rights issues. Everyone should understand that if you interact with Israel, their expectation will be that you will take second-class status to their first, what they consider their first-class chosen people status. Uses anti-Semitism charges strategically. Now, hold on. Let me just say something here. I don't have an issue with people being considered the chosen. I have an issue with people being considered the chosen and then being dicks to everyone else. That's what I have an issue with. Hopefully this doesn't get taken down by TikTok. Uses anti-Semitism charges strategically. Labels critics of Israel's policies as anti-Semites to discredit them, making legitimate discussion about human rights abuses or occupation harder. Digital influence and surveillance. It deploys sophisticated digital operations, including online trolls and bots, hi trolls, and coordinated social media campaigns to intimidate and silence critics, activists, and journalists. Influences laws and politics. Strongly pushes for laws in the U.S. and Europe that makes us not free, that makes us not sovereign, that pushes boycotting Israel, anti-BDS laws, restricting freedom of expression, and protests against Israeli policies. But individuals in said countries, you're welcome to protest against your own country. And Israel will use your media to also protest against your country. Who runs it? Lobbying groups, AIPAC, ADL, Stand With Us, Canary Mission, and Camera. Cyber units and surveillance firms, Israel Unit 8200, NSO Group, Black Cube. The U.S. propaganda machine. The U.S. propaganda machine is a complex system operated by American government intelligence agencies, media conglomerates, and think tanks designed to manage global and domestic perception in favor of U.S. and Israeli geopolitical interests. What it does: it controls global narratives. It promotes pro-U.S. worldview, justifying American military interventions, political decisions, and support for allied governments, especially Israel. Now, let's stop here for just one moment, because again, if you haven't looked up or been informed about clean break document made up in 1996, which was used to do what? Use American military intervention in the Middle East in 5 countries in 7 years, or 7 countries in 5 years. Because it's like, who plans this and writes it down? Media collaboration. Mainstream media outlets, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, regularly align their stories with U.S. government-approved narratives, reducing space for alternative viewpoints. What's important about this is, as we know, I wrote the media for 7 years. You know that I wrote them mitigation steps that could have been taken during the pandemic. I don't know anyone who died from COVID. No one. everyone that I know, I told them to utilize a mitigation step that I learned when visiting a biological dentist. And they taught me a way of cleaning my mouth. And so that's what I did as a protocol with the water pick. And I gave that information out immediately when COVID hit to my family and to my entire community. I believe some folks still passed away, but I didn't know them. So I sent this information to MSNBC over and over and over and over again. I sent it to New York, wrote the governor, wrote the Nurses Association in New York, wrote the Nurses Association in Washington State, wrote Chicago, the Police Guild, wrote a whole lot of people to help protect those frontline people, because I knew it was going to be bad because I had a premonition that and by February of 2020, I had a waking premonition that there was going to be upwards of 645,000 people dying just in America. So I knew it was serious. That's also why I took the vaccine. Cultural influence. Uses entertainment, Hollywood films, TV, and cultural products to subtly export American values and narratives globally. Who runs it? Government agencies, CIA, NSA. It's interesting about the way that the U.S. propaganda machine, what's said here, it really does stand up for one purpose, and that is to shield Israel. Because as an American, the propaganda machine is not protecting me. I'm a black, gay woman. This propaganda machine is not protecting me. It's not here for me. And another waking premonition had in 2017, once Trump was in office, I would say by February, March of 2017, I'd had a waking premonition that we had been breached. We'd been breached. And that breach, it was thought that breach was from Russia, but we now know that it wasn't. It was Russia, it was a whole lot, but it was also Israel. It's a major part of why we are where we are today. And here's my thing. I wrote the president and I said this. I said, look, if these folks are our landlord, if they do own us, come out with it. I'm fucking tired of this. Come out with it already. Come out with it. So how to respond? I said these propaganda machines control what we know, what we don't know, and how we think about important global events, from wars to humanitarian crisis. How many of your friends don't know what's happening in Gaza? And they're American. Understanding them is essential for recognizing manipulation, misinformation, and outright lies presented as truth. How to respond? Stay aware. Notice when narratives feel one-sided or overly simplistic. Check multiple sources. Look beyond mainstream media for independent journalism and first-hand accounts, especially in global conflicts. Recognize the patterns. Understand how labels like anti-Semitism or anti-American can be used to silence valid criticism. Speak out thoughtfully. Use your voice wisely, being clear and fact-based to counter propaganda narratives when discussing sensitive topics. Question the narrative around Gaza and Palestine. Notice what's being emphasized versus what's missing. Watch for anti-Semitism accusations used strategically to end conversations about Israel's human rights abuses. Observe the media framing of U.S. foreign policy, particularly how interventions are justified. Stay engaged and critical, especially on digital platforms where influence campaigns are strongest. Understanding these influence systems is your first step toward clarity and empowered awareness in navigating today's complex information environment. And in the event that any of you want to screenshot any of this, here it is right here. If you want to do your own Zionist or U.S. PR machine lookup, you can do it. All right? All right, you all take care. Have a good day.
Hey friends, this is your intuitive guide to propaganda. We're going to talk about it in terms of intent, methods and results. This is an idea, one of many that these people are trying to put out. The more minds that have this idea in them, the more support and consent of this population these people will get. Most people think of propaganda like this. Two-way communications, right? Message comes out straight to the people, and people return with support and whatnot, right? But it is way more thorough than that. The problem with this paradigm is this is pretty obvious to people, and when they start getting fed up with the government, they start recognizing that this is happening. So, what do propagandists do? They attack other things. Education, literature, public works, national heroes, entertainment. And then the idea cuts through from those mediums and reinforces everything that these people are saying. When this network is significant enough, they don't have to talk directly anymore. The goal is to make your entire world, your entire truth be this. Not your own, not something from your own observations, but what they tell you it is. They do that by trying to dominate your entire world. Now, it's in the propagandist's best interest to maintain this relationship, but it doesn't have to exist after a while. Because here's what happens now. You see something, anything. The message doesn't even have to align with the propaganda. You hear it, you see the propaganda you've been conditioned to listen to agree with, takes hold of it. And it takes hold, and your brain takes it up. And over time, it infects every single thought that you have. And in turn, here's what happens. Those brains become all the brains. These brains do the work for the propagandists. That propaganda becomes a feedback loop. And there doesn't have to be much messaging anymore. If they really needed to change the narrative, they could do it. Just toss it right in here. Just a little nudge to this guy. Or just a quick quip this way. And ironically, this is kind of like a Ponzi scheme. It can only accelerate. Once it stops, these people lose all their teeth. This propaganda is also typically very, very dangerous for a nation. So when it continues to spiral out of control, these people are still at risk. So there's this feedback loop where they feel like they need to do more propaganda. And here's the crazy thing. These people have friends and enemies. The people that these guys are allied with and opposed to can both like the same propaganda, the very same propaganda that helps this organization and also threatens it, will be inserted by the friends to help it, not just into the general population, but to those people themselves. And that organization's enemies are also going to inject that very same propaganda with the intent of hurting them. This is why it's so important to understand thoroughly what propaganda is and why so many of us are upset, because this propaganda and this propaganda was used to help these people, right? By people, by those of us that were opposed to it, right? Lots still fell for this stuff, okay? This is more complicated than you think. It's not just like good message, bad message, okay? The same message can be used to enact great harm by both adversaries and friends to this government and to this people. Moose.
Recognizing propaganda, part 2. Are you propaganda? In the first part, we learned what propaganda is and its ultimate effect. The second part, we're looking inward. But as a quick recap, the whole point is the people who have the idea they want to spread put it into people's brains such that they do not need to communicate directly. They are captured by the propaganda, and every single component of their lives reminds them to think of and reinforce the propaganda. Remember, propaganda captures minds. So I've come up with a model to determine, are you propaganda? A checklist. Let's have a look. We're going to use this acronym, I'm a cutie. Let's go ahead and elaborate. First I, immediacy. When an idea, something comes up in the news, whatever, encounters your mind, how fast do you want to tell people? Do you want to rush to be the first? Do you want to be part of the initial wave? Do you have your mind racing and you don't have a capability of slowing down before you evaluate a belief that you have? That is your immediacy, okay? People that are heavily propagandized will have very, very fast reactions to things they hear about in general. Another trait I've identified is misdirection. When you come across an idea that counters your view, how quickly do you pivot to? Another trait identified is misdirection. When you encounter an idea that's counter to your beliefs, what effort do you make to pivot to other ideas that you can defend? How often do you change what we're talking about in order to, get past the things that you do not feel like you can defend or don't want to defend or feel like you have with a really quick idea, which we'll get to, all right? So how often is misdirection happening at your behest in a conversation? The next is your ability to articulate an idea. Like you have a thought and somebody starts talking about it, like how in depth can you go? If you find yourself unable to do so and it's basically regurgitating ideas, it definitely propagandized, again, in broader context. But if you do have the ability to do this, to articulate, all right, do you find yourself stopping when the logic of a thought or a conversation starts to refute your argument? Or do you start twisting logic to make it happen? Okay, that's one of those. Next, how badly do you feel the need to actually talk about these positions? You're craving. This is something I've encountered recently, actually, when I talked about a concept, the dirty word in a previous video, socialism. And when I was filling in somebody about the conversation that I had, it had nothing to do with arguing the merits of the ideology itself and more so the nature of communication and rhetoric. Yet the person continued to try to defend his position that was anti-socialism, despite the fact that it had no relevance. So that's your craving to talk about it. And it's not just that, it's your craving to receive the messaging and encounter these subjects, right? You've got a high craving to do so, especially when you look at something and immediately think of some other ideological thought. Yeah, you might have it, all right? Moving on, we have unity, all right? Let me zoom in for you guys. Let me zoom in. How closely aligned are your thoughts to others, all right? If you're finding yourself saying things like verbatim, even in the absence of other news or actual talking points, if your thoughts are verbatim with somebody else, I think that's a very, very strong sign. We see this deliberately imposed, like in that Sinclair Media video where all these seemingly, independent news stations were saying more or less the same thing word for word, right? That's a deliberate attempt at putting out something verbatim, all right? If you find that your thoughts end up matching other people's word for word, yeah, that's unity, okay? That's also when you feel unity with other people for having the same thoughts and not necessarily because of other interactions, okay? Might be propagandized, might be propaganda. Do you use thought-terminating cliches, all right? Or do you respond well to them and agree with them when they come up, when they support your ideas, all right? This is very, very common, and this actually goes into misdirection, where people will, propagandized people will use thought-terminating cliches to change the subject of conversation, on a very regular basis. But what about this? And then they start an argument about that. And they'll immediately go, but what about the other thing? And then they'll get into that. And what about the other thing? All right. That's pretty hard to recognize in yourself. But if you find yourself, again, this also ties in the ability to articulate, right? If you find yourself thinking about these things and not desiring to articulate or not feeling the feelings of articulation, you might be propaganda. All right, moving on. We've got intensity. How strongly do you feel about anything in your ideology? All right. Does it invoke emotions before it invokes thoughts? Right? Does it invoke emotions that you want to apply against other people, especially in a debate? Might be propagandized. All right. And the last thing I've identified is endurance. When you do find your special interest, like how often do you bring that back into a conversation? It's kind of ties into the craving here. Craving is your appetite to do it. Endurance is your ability to actually keep the conversation focused on something that you feel like you have to say. All right. Because sometimes you might want to, but you run out of motivation to do so. But if your motivation is strong and your craving is strong, you can stay on topic for a very, very long time. And you can use all of these traits in the process. So how are these different from just simply having an ideology? With the immediacy thing, it's like, if you have a proper ideology that you can back up with logic and emotion and life experience, then you're typically pretty confident in your views, and you don't necessarily think every moment is the time to talk about it, okay? With misdirection, you don't need to constantly change the subject of conversation. You can keep it up with your idea, and if it's challenged, you can accept when your logic fails, and you can come up with ideas to back it up in other ways, for example. But you don't just constantly change the subject in order to avoid losing a conversation, right? Your ability to articulate, this is huge. Can you go into the logic, the thought processes, the history, the life experience, other people's life experience, empathy, law? Like, the more you have on this, it's greater than simple ideology. If you're propagandized, yes, you might be able to do this, right? But the difference here in having an ideology is you can entertain the other thoughts, and you can apply your ideology in a way that entertains these thoughts and even validates them, maybe in your direction, okay? Having an ideology doesn't mean you're always craving talking about it, all right? This craving here, this is like an all-consuming thing, especially when you're propagandized, all right? Unity is another thing. Propagandized people tend to be in lockstep with each other about so many things, all right? And if you lack some of this unity, because it's an indicator that you are some kind of independent thinker, all right? Getting into thought-terminating cliches, you recognize these more as jargon, talking points, and like rallying cries, okay? And less just like ways to just motivate a conversation in your direction, all right? Intensity, people that are sure in their ideology don't need to be loud about it, right? What's that new phrase that I'm seeing around? Maybe it's old but new on TikTok. Your ideas are getting louder, but they're not getting more logical, right? Yeah, you can do that. And then endurance. You don't have like this super strong compulsion. You know when you don't really need to talk about it further because maybe you have to readjust your strategy or go next time. Part of endurance is trying not to miss the moment, which is huge with propagandized people. Pretty big with ideologues, but you don't necessarily need to apply this, especially in a conversation. Anyway, this video is approaching 10 minutes long. I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'm here for you.